doing a brief.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Childhood and Society, our SIG group, where we address eco-pedagogies and difficult dialogues over the year. So for our 2024 series today, we have Professor Jane Osgood, our very own Middlesex University leader of research and of early childhood and childing today, which she'll be sharing with us, an eco-pedagogy of refusal. So I'll hand over to you, Jane, and once we have finished, please, we'll have a dialogue, and do engage with the chat throughout to keep us all intrigued and go into your reactions. So thanks very much.
Thank you for that introduction. So just to say a little bit about this paper, it's co-authored with myself and Sid Mohandas, who was a former PhD student of mine, but happily graduated and is now on to pastures new. But we had the pleasure of writing this piece together on some pedagogical work that we did this time last year. So the paper that I'm presenting is under review, and it's due to be published in, well, I hope it is, in a special issue of regarding eco-pedagogies 3 to 13. So it's very much intended as a kind of collective. The special issue will bring together multiple perspectives, but we're working with post-humanist and multi-species and feminist new materialist and various post theories. So I'm going to share my screen. And this is very much a lecture format, so I will be talking at you for some time, but bear with me. And yeah, as Angela says, any comments, questions, thoughts you have, pop them into chat or keep them to one side, and we'll have a chance to debate them towards the end. Okay, so as Angela helpfully introduced, this paper is about a praxis called childing. And that will become clear as I present the paper. And we are taking up this praxis as a refusal, an eco-pedagogy of refusal. As I said, this is co-authored with Sid Mohandas, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but is very much here in spirit and in word. So let's get started. Okay, so this paper dwells upon what was agitated in a research methods workshop that invited postgraduate researchers to take seriously matter, movement, bodies, and affect as a starting place to explore how eco-pedagogies might become more capacious. We explored ways to contemplate how generating knowledge about education and worldly relationalities to environments might be pursued in less familiar ways. The workshop began with a brief introduction to the praxis of childing, which I'll go on to share with you shortly. This mode of pedagogy actively displaces a search for representation, knowability, linearity, and solutions. Rather, the workshop introduced participants to a range of feminist theories and philosophies, principal among them Haraway, and particularly her invitation to serious play, to go visiting, and to engage in a praxis that might reorientate both thought and practice. So this paper really focuses on what was agitated through the workshop and what embracing this mode of inquiry, how it resonates across disciplinary boundaries. So this is not only a childhood studies activity, it actually became quite cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary. So it's really trying to shift what we might understand by environment, by pedagogy, by sustainability, and by child. So it's really opening out all of those pretty much taken for granted concepts, labels, ideas. So eco-pedagogy has a long and contested history, critiqued on the basis of its essentializing logic, human exceptionalism, and masculinist undertones. It's not something we have time to dwell upon either in the published paper or to be published paper or in this presentation here, but it provides a cautionary note to start on given the theme of the special issue, eco-pedagogies in childhood, and given our position as critical feminist scholars. So whilst we use the term with caution, following Greta Gard, we can test that what we mobilise in our work is queer, feminist, climate justice approach to critical pedagogy. Our work responds to the relatively recent resurgence of ecofeminism, but that too has been critiqued since its emergence in the 1970s, again, for its essentialising, universalising and exclusionary logic. In addition, we take seriously Zoe Todd's critique of the subtle but pervasive power afforded to white scholarship and make a conscious effort to foreground Black and Indigenous scholars in relation to environmental education. We recognise that citational practices can be tricky, especially in finding ways to work with Black and Indigenous thought without appropriating. As Arola expresses, don't Columbus Indigenous knowledge, but also don't ignore it. We are therefore interested in thinking with and researching with these different traditions, not so much in the spirit of mastery, but in humility, bringing them into conversation for a more expansive approach to eco-pedagogy. We're not attempting to conflate these various traditions, but we want to dwell upon the generative overlap amongst them. And what all these approaches share is the central claim to behave in intelligent, attentive, and caring ways towards each other and the more than human world. They also share a challenge to the overrepresentation of man, white, middle class, middle-aged man at that. And here we're working with Sylvia Winter's work, and instead commit to inventing and imagining other modes of becoming that refuse gendered and race determinisms. To overcome this compulsion to dominate, pedagogies must eschew traditional formats and hierarchical classroom structures, many of which duplicate the logic of domination. There are many ways to move away from traditional formats, pedagogies, and structures in education. So inspired by this body of scholarship, we sought to enact ways to refuse the logic of domination in a workshop that I was invited to facilitate at Middlesex University last spring, which will be attended by doctoral researchers from across disciplines and various stages of their PhD journeys. I suspect there will be another one of these creative methodologies half day for postgraduate researchers this year. So our first refusal was to question dominant ways of being in the world that actively promote the Cartesian mind-body dualism that so readily persists in HE pedagogy. Excuse me. Foregrounding childing undoes this pervasive logic by creating fissures in knowledge production through which eco-pedagogy can be reformulated. Inviting participants to engage in affective, embodied, speculative, serious play directly challenges how workshopping should be done. Second, we refused the elevation of the lone expert, all-knowing professor proclaiming to profess how research methodologies should be done. Rather, I proposed to jointly facilitate the workshop with Sid, who was at the time my PhD student. And we directly draw upon our collaborative work that we've published together in childhood studies framed by posthumanism, decolonialism, and creative methodologies. So this was a very deliberate refusal to do workshopping as anticipated and expected. And we were in the business of flattening hierarchies. And it was a strategic move that we've used on several other occasions as a deliberate act of refusal. Like others, we view refusal as central to imagining and enacting pedagogy otherwise. For us, it's a form of activism that directly upends convention to set in motion other ways to pursue knowledge. In anticipation of the workshop, we prepared an abstract and set about loosely planning an afternoon that consciously moved away from predictable, human-centric pedagogies. Our objective then was to respond to an urgent need for approaches in HE pedagogy that refuse essentialism, human exceptionalism, and human supremacy. Refusal as a practice has emerged through the labour of feminist scholars, notably Indigenous feminist scholars and Black feminist thinkers, to describe practices, stances, escape routes, and epistemic spaces opened by various forms of no, and that's tuck and wang. Therefore, we set about playfully refusing habitual ways in which to workshop and instead consider possibilities for effective encounters with the non and more than human to generate alternative forms of knowledge as they emerge from research pedagogy as serious play. We had wanted to choreograph a space that privileged being present in the micro moment, noticing the unremarkable and attending to the in-between, which are usually marginalised or completely overlooked in such doctoral training sessions. Our goal then was to reanimate ways of being in the world that refuse adultist demands for mind over body, rational thought over speculation, seriousness over playful experimentation. So drawing upon more than human scholarly traditions, we responded to calls for a radical relational shift in how education is imagined and enacted. We were in pursuit of an approach where the human, the institutional community, and the non and more than human could come together to engage with one another in more robust and equitable ways than is currently the norm in higher education pedagogy. More than human pedagogy, then, is where learning takes place in more expanded environments. The emphasis becomes locating or creating spaces and opportunities in which students experience embodied, sensed encounters and explore how relationalities take shape between themselves, the environment, and to contemplate histories, legacies, and emergent ecologies of all kinds. This shift in both the place of education and the definition of teaching learning allows the world to play a more prominent role in educational practice. More than human approaches to education recognise that knowledge is always situated and partial, to borrow from Haraway. It is neither possible nor desirable from these perspectives to occupy a vision of knowledge as disembodied, unlocated, or all-knowing. Uncertainty is accepted as a fundamental condition of life. What Deborah Bird Rose celebrates as patchy terrain, where knowledge is always only ever partial, and the emphasis is placed upon situated intuition and the affective intensities of an encounter. For more than human childhood studies scholars, the value of engaging with the ethics of outdoor learning has allowed new imaginaries to be explored and for the future of environmental education, in inverted commas, to be radically rethought. More than human approaches hold the potential to break free from a narrow concern with sustainability, with all its neoliberal humanist saviour narrative residues and desires. Karen Malone. With these research lineages and philosophical legacies to hand, we contemplated a further refusal. How might learning and learner become actively reconfigured by taking the workshop outside? Learners in such encounters are best understood as embodied and emplaced phenomena that extend beyond the bounded individual human subject, beyond cognitive, emotional, and physical capacities, towards ongoing processes of becoming with. Encounters in such contexts are necessarily relational, complex, interactive, and transmogrifying as they emerge within new ecologies. Our next refusal, by taking our speculative praxis outside, was to actively deny the privileging of knowledges and practices of the adult human through an invitation to child as verb. So around 50 postgraduate researchers were invited to choose a half-day workshop from a selection. Professors and other senior researchers at Middlesex University from a range of disciplinary backgrounds provided a brief description of the workshop they were going to run and then gave a pitch. We had to sell our wares, and we presented our workshop, and we suspect that the fact that it was a bright, sunny, early spring day offering escape from stuffy classrooms might have provided a certain appeal. So the workshop was attended by 6 participants from different disciplinary backgrounds: biomedicine, anthropology, English literature, nursing, and childhood studies. We provided an initial introduction to creative methodologies and how it was informed by the philosophical underpinnings I've just set out to you, and critical post-humanism. And that was a very brief introduction of around 10 or 15 minutes. And then we briefly introduced the praxis of childing, which emerged first in the work of Kennedy and Cohen. In mobilising childing as a methodology of refusal in this workshop, we were interested in actively rejecting adultist and human-centric modes of enacting research. We were not asking participants to behave like a child, but rather to embrace the idea that child shifts from noun to verb. They were offered an invitation to child. Childing insists upon a willingness to attune to surroundings, the environment, the sedimented layers of history encapsulated within place, the atmospheric forces circulating, and to embrace a willingness to be surprised, to play with scale, to speed up, to slow down, to spin, jump, balance, to encounter the world in ways long since forgotten or not yet imagined. As Kennedy and Cohen stressed, childhood seems to be a possibility, a strength, a force, an intensity, rather than a period of time. Drawing from a range of feminist, Black, Indigenous and post-humanist thinkers, we stress that the urgency of life in the Anthropocene requires different ways of engaging with the world and thinking about our relationalities to space, place and time. Childing offers one such way. So our workshop invited participants to actively participate in a pedagogy that shifts and flattens ontological hierarchies by moving away from what Haraway terms the God trick of human exceptionalism, and instead embraces embodied, relational, felt encounters as they engage in minor world-making practices that might shift through serious play. Childing outside on the green expanses of the university campus accounted for most of the workshop. We neither directed nor led. Rather, we presented provocations and offered invitations, as you see here on this slide. Participants were encouraged to encounter the feltness of a place that was very familiar to them, where they come to study and socialise daily, that is imbued with certain rules, expectations, customs and habits. Childing in a familiar place in ways that felt taboo or somehow age inappropriate agitated a raft of affective forces. The simple invitation to remove shoes and socks, for example, to experience the coolness of grass beneath feet, the invitation to balance on benches, to hide in small places, to get down low, to inhale, to close our eyes, to engage deeply, differently, with a very familiar place, worked on and through us in various unanticipated ways. Childing has the potential to deepen our engagements with the world. Childing might be a specific kind of relationship to questions, one that opens the questioner to a movement that she or he cannot control or anticipate. It might be the kind of experience where questioning opens experience to the not experienced, thinking to the not thought, and life to the not lived. For the anthropologist in our workshop, in the midst of preparing to undertake research with an Indigenous tribe in India, childing was both curious and liberating. To quote her, she says, "I felt so grounded. I felt the importance of being still, being in the moment. It allowed me to put aside existing ideas and just be in that moment in a really immersed way." She then elaborated on the opportunities that became available to encounter a familiar environment in ways that provoked fresh questions about how else research might be. Reflecting on the workshop, she mused, what might happen if research becomes a way of life? And then, what are the limits of my curiosity? The questioning that sprang forth from participating in the Childing workshop might be thought of as the not thought, or giving life to the not lived, emerging from embodiment and atmospheric forces. To quote Kennedy and Cohen, the infant, the young child, as well as painters, dancers, dramatists, musicians, question with their bodies, or more precisely, with their embodied minds, minded bodies, which grounds logic in the lived bodies. For this participant, the questioning that ensued was an act of refusal. Her willingness to abandon to spaces of incompetence, disobedience, and to refuse what ought to be thought, to do what ought to be done, was for her liberating and allowed for a different engagement with the world that provoked further questions. She questioned whether childing is innocent, pure, romanticized, and concluded, like Kennedy and Cohen, that bad children are those who have broken free of the same. They dare to ask the questions. They refuse to grow up and conform to normativity and order. Childing as an eco-pedagogy of refusal then becomes a space for the incalculable, the unpredictable, the uncontrollable, where opportunities to think what we are not supposed to think are celebrated, and where undisciplining thinking is encouraged. Meanwhile, for the biomedic in the group, the experience was, I quote, really hard. I couldn't go to the maximum. I just couldn't do all those things. I was shy and a bit embarrassed to let other people look at me. But when I looked deeply into the environment, it really affected me. Childing was not as readily available to him. His enculturation into adulthood was firmly rooted, although he later reflected on the liberatory potential for childing to shift how he encounters the world. Making connections to his current parenting, he reflected on how children are constantly under surveillance, just as he had felt during the workshop, judged, observed, regulated by norms, expectations, disciplinary regimes embedded in educational institutions from nurseries through to schools and university. He wondered whether children were ever really free to explore in the ways that we were in the childing workshop. He posed the question, is childing even really available to children? Again, drawing from Kennedy and Cohen, the disciplinary role of adulting promotes the same and urges the child to become adult. Conversely, childing presents opportunities for protest and subversion, and a vital reminder to the adult of what it is to be active in world-making practices, that is, to child. All participants made immediate connections to their own childhoods through the praxis of childing. Kennedy and Cohen stressed that this readiness to connect to our childish experiences can be viewed generatively. They explain, feelings of childhood are retained into the powers of adulthood to make the power of adulthood not the power of the same, but rather a force or energy or joy. Through this tension, there is the possibility of new adult voices emerging, ones which handle the opposition between same and different in alternative ways. The forces, energies, and joys that came to characterize the childing workshop were at times intense and also disquieting. Neither we, as facilitators, nor the participants could have predicted the work that encountering the world from a logic of the lived body was capable of generating. So here we could dwell further upon the affordances that come from a childing praxis that decenters the researcher, flattens hierarchies, and opens up possibilities for connecting to place, community, environment, histories, or as the nursing student articulates, getting your feet dirty, being in that moment to absorb what is happening and where your thoughts might wander. And it connects to surprises, is a really good methodology to occupy. But we would contest that childing is more than a methodology, more than a set of skills or techniques to be mastered. Our concern is with the ongoingness of refusal and how that manifests when orthodoxies and conventions are temporarily suspended, when participants are given permission to encounter the world differently, to embrace a slow engagement with the world, to witness relationalities to the non-innocence of place, matter, histories as they bubble up in seemingly benign ways. The remainder of our paper provides glimpses into how childing on that early spring day on a leafy green university campus worked on and through us in ways that we could not have predicted. Being open to surprises that dwell within assemblages that are at once situated, affective, and have capacities to agitate hauntings and problematics of life in late-stage capitalism, illustrate the huge potential for this mode of inquiry to reconfigure what is readily understood to be eco-pedagogy. So what does childing, this praxis, what does it provoke? What does it agitate? What does it propulse, to borrow from Erin Manning, us to do? So continuing with the spirit of childing and taking deep dives back into eco-feminist, eco-pedagogy and critical post-humanities literature, we allowed ourselves to play, to be open to how the workshop has worked on and through us long after the event itself. And we are often surprised by what surfaces. So one of the things to kind of haunt us, and we call it pavilion hauntings, and you may recognise this structure, it's in the middle of the Hendon campus. And there was a pull from this structure, the outdoor classroom, the pavilion, and the participants in our workshop gravitated towards this structure on campus. And later we became aware of its eco-credentials, that it was created by students in partnership with industry, and it has a very specific set of objectives and stated ambitions for this particular installation, if you like, on campus. But for us, it provoked hauntings and curiosities, and we started to trace where else pavilions might take our inquiries. And we arrived at the exhibition in Wembley, the British Empire exhibition of 1924, just down the road, where we unearthed some really quite traumatic, dehumanizing, fetishizing, and the civilizing project of the British Empire on its colonies. And it sort of, it agitated and provoked all sorts of sort of sitting with the discomfort of the complexities and the non-innocence of pavilions in ways that underline how eco-pedagogies can become something more through childing practice. It's not a moral obligation to look after the world. It becomes something much more, deep excavations of what this pavilion is, what it does, where it takes us. So pavilions are temporary structures, yet there is an inherent impermanence to them. But approaching them analytically from a place that activates childing makes visible the fact that even seemingly inanimate structures, such as the pavilion, are imbued with vital materialism, to borrow from Jane Bennett. When encountered from a childing orientation, the pavilion has profound capacities to reanimate, to open up indelible scars, to agitate and provoke ongoing questioning that deepens our engagements with the world through time and space. Another haunting, the daffodils on that spring day. Really demanded our attention. The daffodils, they're just popping up now, a year later on campus again. And for us, it kind of, it agitated and provoked and enlivened memories that were buried or that belonged to others. So we were reminded of, in this bottom image, this sort of palimpsest of layering of different images, are the sea of daffodils when Middlesex was located at Trent Park. And then that got us into the history of the university and its radical past around arts practice and student activism and it also then took me back to my childhood, where the landed gentry owned the entire village and pretty much everybody in it, and these sort of feudal power relations. And for Sid, the daffodils, seemingly innocent, just, you know, very English plants, aerated buried memories of post-colonial teachings of Wordsworth in his childhood in Kerala, and the deep problematics of that. So taking seriously daffodils, their scent, their vibrant yellow hue, their swish in undulating waves of an early spring breeze, have profound capacities to reanimate. Sitting with the trouble that daffodils evoke is central to the childing practice that we're trying to develop in this paper. So the feltness of place through materiality is reawakened through an eco-pedagogy of childing that attends to so much more than environmental sustainability. Rather, childing as eco-pedagogy is best understood as a series of transformative processes, a metamorphosis for reanimating ourselves through a praxis of refusal that moves beyond narrow confines of rationality and autonomy, and instead creates opportunities to become entirely a part of the animate world, whose life swells within and unfolds all around us. That's a quote from Abram. Stepping into these temporally diffracted worlds allows adults to enjoy capacities to child once again, with full intensity and without age restriction, which in itself is an act of refusal. So in the spirit of Ballant and Stewart, we experimented with the hundreds, and these 132 words, we refused to stick to 100, surface and provoke, resonate and unsettle, pose more questions than answers. Childing allows us to remain in the messy middle of what was agitated on that sunny spring day in North London, and to sit with the discomfort of where childing as an eco-pedagogy of refusal can take us. So childing on campus, tree, stump, lop, growth, rot, net zero, green hero, hijab, bench, chat, basking on bench, aeroplane noise, rustling branch, flaked paint, dilapidated building, signage, pathway, trespass, green campus, feathers, dog feces. Student fees, upgrade panel, dandelions, just park app, daffodils, vulnerable, conspicuous, ridiculous, security pass, balancing, bouncing, belonging, A406 rumbling, cranes, spiking, traffic warden, patrolling. Almond decaf cappuccino, reusable cup, Costa franchise, food bank, minimum wage, hiding, seeking, peaking, strategic plan, curriculum review, visas, boat invasion, Cruella Suella, black mold, asthma, security patrol, rental, exploitation, exploration, childing, chiding, deriding, education, and investment, employability skills, critical thinking, third year sinking, momentary bliss, toes in grass, attuning, bemused, discomfort on campus in view, but who knew this would resurface in ways unanticipated? Worldview shifted, methodology drifted to something less sure, circumspect, and more. I don't know if this will work, but we'll give it a try. This is Sid's. Can you still see? Can you see the video?
No, it's just a picture.
Yes.
Just a picture there, Jane, at the moment.
Okay, let me try another way. Let's try this. Can you see that now?
Yeah, we've got it, and there's a link on there.
Okay, that's it. Childing is a verb, a doing, not a noun.
For me as a researcher, when I go into the
At the class. You're making them tiny and making them big and spinning around and.
But I never went to small.
how sticky the flowers are,
Burden with adult.
It's colonial.
getting your feet dirty.
Light and unsophisticated.
I felt so strong. Liberating.
And then you enter into the field with this kind of openness and speculative, not knowing.
Touch things, be curious.
Tune into the world. Okay, I have no idea how long I've taken or how much time we have left. Oh, there, lots of time for chatting.
Wow, thank you, Jane. Lots of reactions and lots of provocations and really interesting way. And that video, kind of just to comment, it reminded me of a distortion, but then I thought, what is distortion according to who? So I'm going to just stop there. But I know Mona's got a point on there in the spirit of difficult dialogues, but rather than read out your comment, do you want to engage, Mona, and I'll just be at the back and see who else wants to come on after.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting, Jane. Thank you. I was just thinking about this word refusal as you were speaking, and about kind of grey areas and boundaries and holding on to kind of the weight of particular terms. So I was thinking about refusal and how refusal is typically used to kind of invoke a politics of refusal, used in situations where there is an oppressive authority and refusing to be moved by that oppressive authority. So I was thinking about settler colonialism in the West Bank and how refusal has been used as a term in relation to that. And it felt a little bit, I guess the question in my head is this really refusal? Is that really the word that you want to invoke in relation to a postgraduate seminar in a university where you had the authority to do this postgraduate seminar in this particular way, or whether this is kind of a subversion of expectations? So I think it's a question about refusal, but it's also a question about words and the appropriation of words and politics in order to talk about the things that we do pedagogically.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's a really, valid and interesting and important point. Where it comes from is, as I said at the beginning, the sort of Indigenous scholarship and Black feminist, and of course that belongs. And as I also said at the beginning, there's kind of tricky citational politics, don't Columbus, but and avoid appropriating. But this praxis of refusal has actually been written about quite extensively in the space of higher education. So Zimbalist, Bozalek, there's a whole sort of emergent field of scholarship around refusal, specifically in higher education and higher education pedagogy. So I think whilst acknowledging where it comes from and the fact that it's difficult and the fact that it's provocative is intentional. And I think what we do, and I've obviously only given you a kind of surface skittering of the paper in the 40 minutes that I've been talking, but what we do is to kind of excavate the way that the university works on us and through us. And actually, we do need to take seriously what we mean by refusal and what we're refusing and when and how. And it is through the subtle, to borrow from Manning, the minor gestures, the fact that the way that the university works upon the what counts as valid knowledge, the way that knowledge is produced, the way in which we're organized as bodies in spaces and places, and what counts as pedagogy and what's considered valuable and useful, that then becomes very narrowly defined in this instrumentalist outcomes way. Actually, these kind of minor gestures at refusal can be really quite powerful and open up avenues of thinking deeply and otherwise. On the surface level, you kind of introduce the idea of childing as refusal. It can seem quite trivial, but once you actually start to mobilize the theory and think with theory in and through embodied kind of activation of what is going on here and why are we doing this and how is it a form of refusal, then I think you get to that place in a more robust way than perhaps it can appear at first glance.
Mona, did you want to come back, or was that your?
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I think it's really interesting to ask the question: can refusal be done in a minor gesture way? And also, just, I mean, I would keep on coming back to this question of whose authority were you refusing, and I don't necessarily want a kind of response to that, but I think it's really interesting to think: can it be refusal if there is no authority being refused?
But it's not so much whose authority, but the way that authoritative systems and authoritative cultures and practices and institutional spaces work on us in ways that are almost imperceptible. You can't pin it down, but we can form and we comply and we do things the way we do things because that's the way it's always been done, and that's how the kind of atmosphere insists we should. When you dislodge that, when you start to disrupt that, and just through, you know, minor refusals, it can have sort of profound and huge rippling effect that can kind of take us to spaces you couldn't anticipate in advance, but that has can be really, really political, actually, in the refusal of no. You know, we don't have to do things the way that we do, and in being kind of critical and making some of it more visible as to how it is that we're so complicit and so conforming, and that then these things don't get unsettled. And it's not about refusing an authority figure or a set of set of diktats. It's more subtle than that, isn't it? You know, the way that we behave and the way that we feel compelled to behave is sedimented through hundreds of years of history and colonial politics and so, you know, I think, but sitting with the pavilion, for example, and what that agitates, where it came from, and start to do some excavation, you know, the non-innocence of the pavilion becomes something really useful and political to think with.
Thanks, Jane.
Okay.
We've got quite a few interests to get through, and again, I just wanted to add on to you and Mona's point there. I was really interested again in your points about, you know, what are we refusing and why? And again, I'm going to just throw in Mikhail Bakhtín's work on the language that we use, such as the word refusal, you know, and the inherited meaning, beliefs, values, everything that's kind of inherited into that word that we're not always conscious of, and that's like any word we use, actually. But the refusal is a dominant and powerful word, and you know, who's refusing, and it brings in the agency and determination, which I know you'll know by now I'm interested in. But I'll stop there because we've got Philippa who wanted to respond to Mona and Jane's points, and then we have Claire, and then we'll go on to Omira afterwards. So over to you, Philippa.
Hi, thanks. Jane, thank you very much. I'm going to need to re-look at this or re-listen to this because there were lots of terminologies which I really need to get my head around, and I'm so keen to. Couple of things. One, the word refusal. My work is, my research is about the exclusion of Black Caribbean boys from schools and the prevention mechanisms which can be used in order to change the disproportionality of the exclusions. And this is just profound in terms of thinking about how Black boys learn. Two is, it brought me to forest schools and the Swedish concept of learning outside. And one of the schools I work with are working towards having just being like a flagship forest schools in North London. So they just go into the forest and learn just by being outside, and the profound change in the children is just astronomical, and it works, and the children love it, and it's just brilliant. So no matter, you know, rain, wind or shine, as long as they've got the right clothing on, they can be outside and they can learn, which is great. The word pavilion sparks some great passion in me. There's a pupil referral unit in Whetstone called the Pavilion, and it's definitely not the learning inspirational structure in Middlesex campus. It is a pupil referral unit for children who can't be managed in mainstream school, and even the design of it sparks some horror in me because it looks like D-Wing in Murmured Scrubs rather than an inspirational place. And then just a couple of things on back to school refusers. I'm doing a parent workshop at the moment, and the number of parents who are there whose children are school refusers, in effect, who just refuse to go to school, and the problems they're having as a result of this is quite astonishing, and the reasons why, and then the behaviour that goes around the refusal of going to school. So that was just my thoughts. I just needed to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you so much. And this is kind of what we see the potential of this sort of work to do is, you know, when the tentacles start to unfurl, they go on, and people, you know, you will get something else from this and something else from this. Somebody else will sit with what pavilions are, what they do, start to excavate it, make connections, and it then becomes something else and something else and something else. I've done some work with forest schools, and this idea of outdoor learning as being close to nature and devoid of rules. And of course, that's a mythology as well, because you see the early years foundation stage curriculum imposed just outside, and the regulation of bodies is, you know, is done in a different way, and the expectation for learning outcomes, measurable learning outcomes, becomes a kind of burdensome pressure as well. So, you know, it's a kind of the complexities of all of this, but I'm just really pleased that it kind of did some things, you know, it kind
Yeah,
of
absolutely. I was
something.
just profoundly interested in how I can think about this in terms of my own work and just work that I'm doing at the moment and the experience I'm having right now, and why they would have chosen the word pavilion for that place when it's definitely the opposite of what you're explaining. And it's just an awful place. But, you know, your picture is great and idyllic in the fields and the flowers, but this place has 0 flowers. And
But of course, where it took us to Wembley, just up the road, to the British Empire Pavilion, the pavilions of the British Empire, that is really quite traumatic place to kind of then start digging around in. But it's a very real and quite recent part of our history, just road. So, you know, it's like, where do these things take us once they start to agitate, once you start to kind of pick at something and then take it seriously and to see where it can take us, then it can, you know, it really is really political work that you get yourself into, and really important actually, but on the surface can seem a little bit frivolous. And, you know, the very thing of childing and you know, yeah, kind of taking your shoes and socks off, making yourself tiny, making yourself big, all sounds a little bit, you know, silly. But actually it's Haraway's serious play in the kind of political places it takes you.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So I think we've got Claire next, then O'Mary, and then Joe, and hopefully we'll get that all in by 1 o'clock. So we have 10 minutes left. So Claire, over to you.
Okay, hi, thank you, Jane. It was very interesting. My question is just, when you were describing how people were sort of out in the pavilion, sort of taking their shoes and socks off, feeling the grass in their toes, the breeze, the flowers and things, it just reminded me of mindfulness in a natural environment, because mindfulness is all about grounding yourself in your embodied experience, and you know, being aware of things like feeling of wind on parts of your body, feeling pressure of whatever it is you're sitting on or standing, you know, all these kinds of things, just being aware of those physical sensations, very embodied, and kind of observe sorry, excuse me, observing thoughts as they pop into your mind. So rather than sort of consciously thinking or meditating on something, you try and kind of clear your mind, and then thoughts kind of bubble up, and then you just kind of observe the thought rather than actually kind of engaging with it. So like if a worry comes in, you don't start worrying about the worry, you just like, oh, I'm having that thought about my worry about whatever it is. Or
I think there are definitely traces, but I think the kind of the objective, if you can say that about a post-humanist approach, is different. But so it's not about the human individual and kind of freeing your mind and being in touch. Rather, it's about allowing the space, place, history, atmosphere, weather, whatever it is, to work on and through you. And actually not to try to empty your mind, but be troubled, you know. So the biomedic who just couldn't do it was just like looking at me like I was an absolute Fruit Loop, balancing on beams and climbing in tiny spaces. And he's just like, no, that I will not be doing that. And it's like, that's fine. You go, you do what you feel, you know, is a place that you can go. But nevertheless, speaking to him some months after, something happened when you encounter a familiar space in an unfamiliar way, and you allow like the materiality and the atmospheres and the kind of history of a place and the geography of a place and all of that to work on you differently, rather than just walking through campus as you always do, and the place becomes so familiar that you don't, you know, you stop noticing. So it is about noticing and attuning, but not with the objective of clearing your mind to reach a better, healthier place. In fact, you're probably in a worse place in terms of mental health by the time you start excavating some of this stuff. So But
I mean,
yes,
I don't know whether mindfulness is just about emptying your mind. I think it's allowing things to come to the surface, because often you kind of know in a gut way an answer to something that's been bothering you, and it's partly allowing space for that answer to come up. You know, if you want to sort of link
Yeah.
it to sort of philosophy
Entering the
and
world
psychology,
differently.
it's like Polanyi's sort of idea of, you know, the sort of the role of the intuition, that's sort of like that's something that you can almost touch, and it's trying
Yeah.
to create that space for you to be able to touch that thing that
Yeah, it's about the affective force and the atmospheric forces and things that are kind of in us, around us, but kind of bigger than us. But yeah.
I
So
mean,
yeah,
I can see how, you know, Childing is far more politically motivated, but I just thought there was sounded quite similar
yeah,
in ways.
definitely. Thanks for that, Claire.
Okay, I'm going to move over to Amari now. Thank you, and then Joe.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think I preferred it when you called me O'Mary earlier. First person ever to call me O'Mary. No, I like it. It's a nice segue into this, because O'Mary kind of invites me to be in touch, better in touch, as we men have to be, with our feminine side. And I felt like,
Can I apologise? I'm still in
no, it's fine.
I'm in St Patrick's Day mode, and you have a bit of an Irish kind of twang to it a little bit, so it's coming out. So apologies.
No need to apologise. I like it. It kind of reminded me of what Childing feels like for me. It's really quite an amazing seminar. I'm glad I joined on board, because it kind of it makes you the mirror. I feel like it's inviting me to be my own mirror, and I was I'm involved in equity. I'm very passionate about equity, particularly at postgraduate level education, because that's where I am right now, doing a PhD here, starting in September, as I said earlier. And it reminded me of the tensions. Childing reminded me of the tensions between the ideas and the fixed pedagogies, and actions, you know, and actually doing. And often in society, we celebrate ideas above everything else, above all else. But really, it's what changes the world. History's shown more and more is action, and knowing sometimes when inaction could be as powerful as action. And it reminds me again, with my equity lenses on, of the whole civil rights movement in America, which has always been cited alongside Gandhi's struggle against colonialism under the British Raj. But always it's forgotten that Gandhi got his inspiration from British feminists, you know, the whole suffragette movement. So I always see a synergy with what I'm trying to do with the feminist movement, past as well as present. Yeah, it reminded me of meditation as well, because I'm very into meditation and mindfulness, and it seemed very much like that. I imagine parents would be more open to Childing than perhaps people who haven't been parents. I don't know, because you kind of already, you have to do silly things with your children, which you thoroughly enjoy, and you find very therapeutic after. I know I do as a father. I mean, my little boy's not a little boy anymore, he's in his 20s, but all of this was conjured up by these reflections. So I'm really appreciative. Thank you. It was really quite amazing. It's raging against the machine, but not in an offensive, threatening way, by causing us all to be a mirror, and by causing us all to, inviting us all to look at what we're doing and how we're doing things, and that we're responsible for the world that we are share, you know, for the world we're in, and that we have to interact with it consciously and with cognizance, full cognizance. So thank you.
You're welcome. I think, yeah, I mean, so many points that you've raised there, but I think the idea, so the idea that Childing is more available to parents, I think yes and no. You know, I think for the biomedic, you know, this kind of experience of Childing and the refusal to child, or the hesitancy to child, but kind of getting what the kind of objective or the intention was, and then taking that back to life with his 2 young daughters and say, oh my God, that's why they linger around and they want to sniff this and poke that, and I can't get them to move on, and you know, that's more interesting than this. So it's kind of opened up this kind of insight into, okay, so if you allow yourself to kind of get caught up with whatever it is, the smell, the taste, the sensation, whatever it is, then you know, you live life in another way. And I think that's where childing as not the sole preserve of children is really quite exciting, because it kind of gives you a license to kind of revisit that place, actually, but in a way that isn't trivialized. It's actually really serious. So yeah, thank you for your reflections.
Okay, Joe, okay to...
I'm mindful of time and that we've only got 2 minutes, so I'll be super quick, everyone, because we're all hungry, I bet. So Jane, thank you very much. As ever, you've taken us on an adventure of thinking. And I want to pick up on the word haunting. You talked about the daffodils and the haunting and the traces of what can't be seen. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I suppose it's hauntological. It's just a little bit, you know, Derrida derived, but I mean, it's really about, I suppose it's the childing and the haunting coming together, where what gets provoked and agitated, and then you're kind of transported to places that you've potentially long buried, long forgotten, and then there they are slapping you around the face and demanding to be taken seriously. And then you start to excavate, because there's also the kind of romanticized memories or the horrific memories of what it was then. But when you actually go back and you start to dig through archives and you know, blogs and accounts and whatever, that other stories start to emerge again. So, you know, the pavilions at the British Empire were a good case in point. I was familiar with them, but going back into them and then looking at stuff that has been written by Black feminists and feminists like in different geopolitical contexts, and how the imprint, the scars that has left in so many places across the world deserves to be taken seriously. So, you know, it's kind of, but we didn't know that that's where we would end up in this kind of inquiry. But it's so, and that, you know, it can happen with anything. It could have just as easily been a blade of grass or a, you know, whatever else, that it when taken seriously, can kind of take us to places we couldn't anticipate, but we absolutely must go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, wow, that's an amazing timing, Joe. That was creative and inspirational. Jane, thank you so much for a really provocative session today. And I really enjoyed all of the, I think we all enjoyed all of the provocations and the kind of engagements and the depth. So hopefully, if there's anything that anybody would like to continue, please contact Jane directly or come and do a session with us, and we'll have some more difficult dialogues. So our next session is on the 8th of April, which is a difficult dialogues with myself, introducing a new project from our placement and practice research from our students, through our students, for 21st century early years practice. So thank you all again for your time, and especially those that zoomed in at the last moment. Thanks so much, and look forward to networking and meeting you all again. And Jane, thanks so much for today. Brilliant. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.